86% of these 12-and-a-half-year-olds weren't meeting guidelines for screen time. So they were engaging in more than 2 hours per day on screens.
It's really difficult for people presenting, particularly with depressive disorders or mood disorders, to engage in good, healthy sleep habits, to exercise when, your mood is so low and when, you're struggling to get out of bed.
Childhood, adolescence absolutely needs to be the time where we're starting to do our preventive work, because we do know that these behaviours track into adulthood.
The no-do gap, the idea that we all are very well aware of the benefits of exercise, but more knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to go out and engage in the behavior. And the implication there from an exercise psychology point of view is we need to make it fun and what we call affectively pleasing, so people actually enjoy it in the moment.
Challenging things to do with their parenting and the household environment, so reducing, stress at home, but also things such as, teaching them about rule setting, so setting appropriate rules for screen time and bedtime.
Before we dive into today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, an important disclaimer. We do dive into the weeds of mental health, which means that at times we discuss sensitive topics like suicide, self-harm, and substance abuse. If hearing such discussion does bring up distress for you, please do seek the psychological and professional treatment that you need. The content covered in this episode is not intended as a substitute for professional mental health treatment. Hello everybody and welcome back to the show. Today we are joined by Dr. Katrina Champion to discuss all things lifestyle behaviours in adolescence. Katrina is a senior research fellow at the University of Sydney and is the program lead for the Healthy Lifestyle Research at the Matilda Centre. In today's episode, we discuss the alarming rates of poor lifestyle behaviours in adolescence, things like poor diet, poor sleeping patterns, excessive screen time, and low rates of physical activity. We also discuss the consequences of these lifestyle behaviours on both physical health and mental health, and how they can have a big impact throughout adolescence and adulthood. We then explore Katrina's research and her thoughts on how we can actually change these behaviours in adolescence. This is a really important conversation, given adolescence is a crucial time when habits can be set, crucial time for the brain neurodevelopmentally. So to explore the use and the risk of lifestyle behaviours, from diet to exercise to sleep to screen time to substance use, is a really valuable conversation, especially given the high prevalence of some of these poor lifestyle behaviours, which you'll hear about in the episode. As always, if today's discussion brings value to your life, we would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe, follow, or to share this podcast with someone you care about. The mission here is to distribute accessible, evidence-based discussion and knowledge on all things lifestyle behaviours for mental health, particularly exercise, diet, sleep. So this episode is right up that alley, and really hoping that people are able to take accessible steps in improving their own lifestyle behaviours based off these conversations. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot to us here at the Mental Wellbeing College. And now to the episode with Dr. Katrina Champion. Right. Dr. Katrina Champion, welcome to the Mental Wellbeing College.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's fantastic to have you on. We're going to be talking all things lifestyle risk behaviours, particularly those in adolescence. And it's a topic of real importance and significance, I think, particularly when we look at what these behaviours predict in terms of outcomes for physical and mental health, which we'll certainly dive into. But if we're talking lifestyle risk behaviours, Katrina, what are we talking? What are these behaviours that we're referring to?
Yeah, so the ones that I guess my research have mainly focused on are what we call the big six risk behaviours or risk factors. And these are modifiable behaviours within a person's life, specifically physical inactivity, poor diet, poor sleep, screen time, and specifically recreational screen time. So we're not worried about, time they spend on screens for schoolwork or anything, as well as alcohol use and tobacco use. We know that these aren't the only risk behaviours, so there's certainly other risky things that young people might engage in, but these ones are really common, and they are associated with a number of health issues, both in the short term, so things such as obesity, mental health problems, as well as increasing the risk of problems later in life, such as heart disease, diabetes, and cancers.
Yeah, okay. So these big six, you said that they're quite common in adolescence. And I'm curious, can you give us a sense of what the prevalence of these behaviours are, even in just Australian adolescents, to kind of paint a picture as to what's really going on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So we conducted a study not too long ago, and we had over 6,500 adolescents. They were in year 7, so aged about 12 and a half on average. And we measured, asked them about the big six. And what we found that rates, particularly of screen time, were really high. So 86% of these 12 and a half year olds weren't meeting guidelines for screen time. So they were engaging in more than 2 hours per day on screens. Rates of physical inactivity were also really high. Over 3/4 weren't getting enough physical activity. Poor sleep was also prevalent. So over 60% weren't getting the recommended amount of sleep per day, and diet as well. About half of our samples, over 50%, were reporting a poor diet. When we looked at alcohol and tobacco use, they were only 12, so you kind of wouldn't expect them to be highly prevalent at that age. But other data, of course, shows that, by kind of mid-adolescence, a significant proportion of young people are engaging in risky alcohol use and smoking.
Yeah, quite stark, those numbers, that the vast majority are engaging in risky behaviours, so not getting enough physical activity, excessive recreational screen time. And I think one really big kind of learning I had from reading through your work, Katrina, was this idea of clusters, that these don't really work in isolation, but if you are presenting or engaging in one of these risky behaviours, you're more likely to be engaging in another one. So can you speak to the importance of a cluster of these behaviours?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's pretty well established that risk behaviours don't usually occur on their own. They do kind of co-occur in these risk behaviour bundles, I guess. From that same study in the 12 and a half year olds, we looked at the number of risk factors that they were engaging in at the same time. And again, the rates were pretty high. So over 60% reported engaging in 3 or more of those big 6 risk behaviours, and about 1/4 of the sample reported engaging in 4 or more. There's been other work that's looked at the specific ways that they kind of co-occur together, and it does, depend on the sample, depend on the country. But I guess probably the strongest evidence is for substance use behaviours. So there's pretty good evidence that alcohol and tobacco use go together. So, a young person who drinks alcohol at a risky level often is more likely to also smoke. And there's also some evidence that kind of these energy balance behaviours, so things such as physical inactivity, sedentary behaviour, screen time, and sleep also co-occur. So I guess what that might look like, thinking of a stereotypical teenage boy or girl, it could be that, they come home from school and they jump on they start gaming. They might stop to do a bit of homework, have some dinner, and then they game all night into the night. So really, that young person, they've got really high rates of screen time.
Yeah.
They're not getting enough physical activity. They're not getting enough sleep. So yeah, it's this idea that how one behaviour might impact others.
Yeah, and it seems like the consequences or risks, particularly when you have these clusters, really start to kind of increase and compound in terms of the physical health and the mental health outcomes. That I think the way that I've seen it termed by yourself and others is that the effects are not additive, but they're multiplicative, that they kind of multiply upon each other when you have more of these risk factors clustering together.
That's right. That seems to be, the biggest concern, that, these risk behaviours, they kind of work together synergistically to increase the risk of a whole range of health problems. So, they increase the risk of chronic disease and problems later in life, as well as some evidence that they might have the same synergistic effects for mental health.
Yeah. Yeah. So from a mental health perspective, like in Australia, to give listeners, particularly if they're not from an Australian background, the mental health rates are relatively stable, or they're pretty high across the general population, but particularly in youth, they're quite concerningly high and increasing. I was looking at some data, I think, from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, that particularly in female young adults, rates of mental illness have increased in recent years. I'm curious, as with your research background, what's kind of the effect of the engagement in these lifestyle risk behaviours with that in the context of the youth mental health crisis?
Yeah, so I think there's no doubt that that youth mental health in Australia and globally, is a big issue. And as you say, rates have been increasing over time. I think there's a range of factors that are probably at play there. So people say that, it's due to these kind of trends around the world. So things like climate change, worries about the cost of living crisis, kind of social isolation after COVID-19. But I do think that these lifestyle risk behaviours, such as the big six, do play a role. I've been lucky enough to have one of my PhD students, so Scarlett Smout, really has, dived into this research and taken a good look at the relationships, so both cross-sectional as well as longitudinal, so over time, to unpack how the big six related to mental health. She was looking at these relationships cross-sectionally. She used a sample, again, of Year 7 students, so over 6,500 young people. And what she found was each of these big six behaviours were associated with anxiety, depression, and psychological distress. So when we looked at associations between these big six risk factors and mental health outcomes over time, what we found was that increases in health-promoting behaviours, so things such as physical activity, fruit and vegetable intake, were associated with lower rates of psychological distress, whereas increases in risky behaviours, such as excessive screen time, were associated with higher rates of psychological distress. And what the findings showed, I think a really important takeaway message from this study, were that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So even, small changes in these big six behaviours, such as adding an extra serve of fruit or vegetables to your diet, or getting an extra hour of sleep per night, can have mental health improvements.
Yeah, really interesting. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is this kind of bidirectional relationship, right, between these health behaviors that you outlined, the physical activity, the diet, the sleep side of things, and mental illness symptoms, whether it's depression or anxiety disorders. I mean, one thing that kind of I see in practice as a psychologist is it's really difficult for people presenting, particularly with depressive disorders or mood disorders, to engage in good, healthy sleep habits, to exercise when, your mood is so low and when, you're struggling to get out of bed. So I suppose it speaks to how one affects the other, but also how if you have these illnesses, that makes it more difficult to engage in some of these health behaviors as well, that bidirectional relationship.
Yeah, it's a really important point. So I guess this study was looking at the impact of the big six on mental health outcomes, but it's just as important to look at it the other way. And I think it kind of, lends itself to really taking prevention and treatment approaches that try to address both. So try to not only, improve mental health and kind of increase, people's capability to engage in these health promoting behaviours, to see those benefits, but also the other way around, trying to improve the health behaviours to see the improvements in mental health. So lots of work to be done, but I think an approach that kind of tries to do it all would be really important and beneficial.
Yeah, and it seems like that's really why a lot of your work is so important, right? Because yours focuses on, the adolescence, that really kind of key critical period when people are setting up some of these habits that will go into adulthood, and that's typically when I think 50% of all common mental illnesses have their age of onset by 14, which means that when the first symptoms start to arise in this kind of critical period. So it speaks to the importance of getting those habits and developing healthy habits in that time that you're researching into.
Yeah, exactly. So the adolescent years are so important. I guess, from our own work, we saw that even by the first year of high school, so year 7, age 12, that a lot of these risk factors were already, really high and pretty entrenched. So I think, childhood, adolescence absolutely needs to be the time where we're starting to do our preventive work, because we do know that these behaviours track into adulthood. So, a young person who is physically inactive as a teenager is more likely to be physically inactive as an adult. So there's this real opportunity to kind of intervene during the teenage years. As you say, it's also the time when mental disorders tend to have their first onset. So a real opportunity to try to change, I guess, the trajectory of their health patterns.
Hello everyone, a quick break from today's episode. At the Mental Wellbeing College, we are committed to the goal of communicating evidence-based wellbeing strategies out to the broader community. The goal of this podcast is to bridge a gap between self-help material and peer-reviewed research by providing evidence-based discussion that respects the nuances of psychology but is digestible for all audiences. Ultimately, I hope that you as a listener feel empowered after each episode so that you can take away and implement strategies to improve your own mental well-being. If you have gained value from this episode of the Mental Wellbeing College, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe or follow, or to share this episode with someone that you love. This is how we continue to grow the show, get the message out, and to impact people in need by providing such information and strategies. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot to us here at the Mental Wellbeing College. And now back to today's episode. So, with some of these health patterns and these clusters of behaviors, what are the real key kind of mechanisms underlying, not the effects of them, but why someone would engage in them? What makes a 12-year-old more likely to be physically inactive, to have poor sleep, to have poor diet? Are there particular kind of common themes across these risky behaviors?
I don't think so. It's a big question, and I don't think there's any kind of one established single mechanism by which these risk behaviours, occur and how they're related to mental health. I guess in terms of why some people engage in multiple risk behaviours compared to other students might not engage in any. Some research suggests that it might be personality, a shared vulnerability to engage in risk behaviour, and also the idea that, as we've spoken about, once you kind of engage in one behaviour, so such as screen time, for example, you're already displacing or you're already taking away time that could be spent doing physical activity or sleep. So it's that real flow-on effect.
Yeah. And I suppose it begs the question then, Katrina, in terms of what can we do, interventions, how can we change and positively impact these behaviours? I know a lot of your work has looked into this. So what are kind of the key findings there in terms of interventions?
So I think probably the biggest takeaway is that there's no single intervention or no single approach that is going to, kind of fix these big six health behaviours or improve young people's mental health.
Okay.
I've done a lot of work in schools. Much of my research has been involved in school-based interventions, and I think they absolutely have a place. For a number of reasons, that students spend such a big proportion of their time at school. It's a way that educators and researchers can really catch, large numbers of students. In terms of the big six and mental health, these are both topic areas that teachers have to deliver education on. So they're mandated parts of the health education syllabus and curriculum. So there's all those kind of, real world benefits as to why schools are an ideal intervention setting. One program that we have focused on over the past number of years is something called Health for Life. So this is a school-based, what we call multiple health behaviour change program. So that just means it's a program that targets multiple health behaviours rather than, single risk behaviours. And the idea there is that it's more efficient, more cost effective, and that there might be these kind of flow on behaviour change effects. So the kind of knowledge and skills that might be learnt in relation to one behaviour, such as physical activity, could then be transferred to another behaviour without. Health for Life, it's based on a prevention model that we have used to prevent substance use among school students here at the Matilda Centre. And basically, it's a web-based program that students complete at school in Year 7 in their health education classes. And it's basically a web-based kind of comic or cartoon, online cartoon, I guess. Yeah. So students kind of log on and they view 6 different lessons. The storyline, follows a group of teenagers the same age as them, all about their experiences with the Big Six, and a bit of drama thrown in there as well to try and, keep them engaged and draw them in, while also imparting that important health promotion messaging.
Yeah.
And we conducted a big clinical trial of the program, basically, to see if it works. So we recruited 6,600 students across New South Wales, Queensland, and Western Australia. Mm-hmm. We gave half of the schools, so we had 71 schools. Half were randomised or randomly allocated to receive the Health for Life intervention that we developed, and other half we said just complete your usual health education. And what we found was when we looked at the Big Six outcomes 2 years after they completed the intervention, we found that students had significantly greater knowledge about the Big Six. So they knew more about, what the Big Six were, the health harms, the national guidelines. So, how much sleep should they be getting? So their knowledge was improved, and that effect lasted for 2 years after the intervention.
Oh, yeah.
But we didn't see any actual behaviour change, which is a bit disappointing. Okay. So we had hypothesized that this, 6-week intervention would equip young people with the skills and knowledge to be able to make changes in their behaviours. We didn't see those actual changes, but we did see the improvements in knowledge. And then Scarlett Smout looked at the mental health outcomes, and she did see that students who received the Health for Life program had significantly better psychological distress and depression outcomes, but only in the short term. Okay. So some short-term benefits, but, it does seem that, more work needs to be done to kind of refine the intervention, sustain those effects a bit longer, and see if we can improve its impact.
Interesting, that finding of increased knowledge, but that didn't translate to behaviour change. This reminds me of, in exercise, this notion of the no-do gap, the idea that we all are very well aware of the benefits of exercise, but more knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to go out and engage in the behavior. And the implication there from an exercise psychology point of view is we need to make it fun and what we call affectively pleasing, so people actually enjoy it in the moment. It's not just about this is the benefits, this is the benefits, this is the benefits. Does that apply here at all, or do you have any kind of hypotheses as to why the increase in knowledge didn't necessarily translate to behaviour change in adolescents?
Few kind of things that we think might have gone on. I think it's pretty well known that, knowledge, just as you say, just telling someone to do something is not enough. We did also have a smartphone app that was developed to accompany the program, that was developed by my colleague, Dr. Louise Thornton. And the idea there was that the students would complete the main core program in school, have this supplementary or complementary app. They could set goals and monitor their behaviours and kind of receive motivational advice and kind of do all that extra kind of, skill building, help them to apply the knowledge that they'd learned into their own lives. But what we found that actually very few students used the app. So it kind of didn't work as we had expected, uptake of this app that we developed that, we thought was going to be fun and engaging and help with that behaviour change. It just wasn't used by many students, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I was having a look at some data yesterday on physical activity in young people, and this comes back to what we're talking about, but the idea that in 15 to 17-year-olds, the top motivator for people exercising is fun and enjoyment, and then from 18 to I think 24, it drops significantly, and the key reason is for health and fitness, so more of like a rational kind of reason to exercise rather than fun and enjoyment. But what also tends to happen is in that age group, 15 to 17 to 18 plus, actual physical activity levels tends to drop significantly. So the point that I want to raise to you is, do you feel like a real key to sustained behavior change in adolescence is that fun and enjoyment piece, whether it's with eating healthy, whether it's physical activity? Don't know how that would work with healthy sleep, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it has to be part of it for sure. And we did kind of, try to include that messaging around, choose physical activities that you enjoy, choose physical activities that are fun.
Yeah.
But I guess, there just wasn't enough there for young people, I think, to be able to take the next step, to be able to take away that knowledge and put it into practice. So other things I think that we've spoken about, better using teachers, so kind of providing further training to teachers to help young people, take away the key messages and set goals, or peer coaches. So, we know that young people, sometimes prefer that kind of peer-to-peer support rather than teacher-student. And then, of course, things such as, parents and the home are still really important, even into the adolescent years, especially for these types of behaviours, such as diet and physical activity. So I think, we're doing some further work at the moment to develop a new intervention for parents to try to teach parents, or I guess empower parents, or give them the skills to be able to support their teenage children to improve their big six behaviours. So changing things to do with their parenting and the household environment, so reducing stress at home, but also things such as teaching them about rule setting, so setting appropriate rules for screen time and bedtime, do that, role modelling healthy behaviours themselves, open communication, and shown to have a protective effect in terms of reducing risky alcohol use. So lots of, I think, modifiable factors to do with parents and families, and also it might be an opportunity to help to improve these risk behaviours.
So it seems like from what you're saying, there's like multiple ways in, multiple contexts in which you could implement interventions. There's school, peers, you said, family. I'm curious, I mean, when I was 13, 14, my parents weren't cool at all in my eyes. And, if anything, I wanted to, do the opposite of what they wanted of me, like most teenagers. Do you find that parent interventions have differing kind of effectiveness, or is moderated by like the age of the adolescent? So they're more effective when an adolescent is younger, say, and then the school or peers become more important, and therefore peer-based interventions might work better as they get older?
And I don't know of that evidence off the top of my head, but I think that sounds, that sounds like that would make sense. So early adolescents, they're still a bit impressionable, still, within the kind of, open, I guess, to what their parents say. But the evidence does show that parent-based interventions, so kind of parents' interventions rather, that are developed for parents, accompany school-based programs. So students get the school-based program, parents get the parent program, and then when they're delivered in conjunction, they do show good effects in terms of change for some of these big six risk factors.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the two almost complementing each other, coming at it from two different angles.
Yeah, I think it's, even the links between the two. So a student might learn something at school, and then for homework, for example, they set a task to go home and talk to your parents or caregiver, whoever it might be, about what you've learned, or to set a joint goal together. That seems to be some of the strategies that work well.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Yeah, and you mentioned a few of those kind of parent-based interventions, or the strategies rather, the modelling, the rule setting. Is it important to also change the parents' behaviours themselves through the interventions? And I suppose this ties into modelling, right? If a parent themselves is engaging in poor sleep or poor physical activity, or is it more important to change the way that they parent for their adolescent, or is it a combination of both really that's needed?
I think it's a combination of both. I think
right.
lots of these interventions do try to improve, like the health of the family, because I think it would be hard to expect a young person to adopt these health promoting behaviours if that's not what is modelled at home for them. So I think that is a really big part. But then it also is around, positive parenting.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So you mentioned the Health for Life intervention, Katrina, which sounds like you guys are iterating and hoping to re-implement as well. Yeah. Are there global successful case studies of health behaviour interventions in adolescents in particular? Any particular case studies that come to mind, or not really?
Not really. I think in general, what the evidence kind of shows is that, yes, there's this potential for these, interventions to work. So all these benefits of the school setting that I've spoken about, it makes sense. But really what the evidence has shown is that some of them work, but if they do, the effects are pretty short-lived. So, there might be improvements in some of these behaviours in the short term. And if there are improvements, they're only small. So I think it's kind of, for the field, it's lots needs to be done. It's not like there's these kind of standout existing interventions, certainly that target all of the big six. There's definitely, some good effective programs for substance use or, specific risk behaviours. But when we're thinking of these multiple health behaviour change programs that kind of try to do it all, there's no real standouts. But I don't think it's to say that, they're not, there's no potential, they're not any good. I think it's that we just need to, go back to the drawing board a little bit and think about the best ways to refine and optimize and make use of things like emerging technology. And, of course, co-design with young people is really important. So we developed the Health for Life intervention back in 2017, 2018, which is quite a long time ago now. So, it's really important for us to be speaking to young people in 2024 to see if there's any changes, that they might be needed to make to the intervention to reflect kind of current trends or what it's like to be a teenager in 2024.
Yeah, and it sounds like you said, plenty of opportunity and potential for significant improvements, and I'm sure opportunity for researchers like yourself, right, to continue to make a real impact in this space.
Exactly.
I'm curious then, kind of just finally, Katrina, if there are particularly people working with adolescents, clinicians, particularly mental health practitioners, tuning in who might have the opportunity to have a real impact on young people and adolescents, as per the audience of this podcast, would you have any advice for them or words of wisdom to help them kind of have an impact in that space?
I think probably a good takeaway is that it doesn't have to be these huge changes. It doesn't have to be, improvements in all of these big six. I think, the national guidelines that are set by the government for these behaviours, they're quite aspirational. And I think for many young people and parents and people working with teenagers, they seem really kind of out of reach. For example, for physical activity, they're meant to be doing 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity every single day. And so if you're striving to kind of, meet that guideline, well, yes, it might be hard and, they might not achieve it. But if you kind of just break it down and just think about, okay, well, what can I do today? And can I just, do moderate to vigorous physical activity on 2 days per week rather than trying to do it every day? Because as Scarlett's work showed, even these small changes in these health behaviours do have an impact, do have mental health improvements. So I think trying to break it down, think about making smaller changes, setting realistic goals, would be the best way forward.
I love that. It's the idea of consistency beats intensity, and then promoting adherence. And I'm glad to hear that you also, as a researcher in this space, thought that those guidelines were aspirational. Because I played a lot of sport growing up, but I don't think I ever got 60 minutes per day of moderate to physical activity. It is aspirational.
It's huge.
As you say.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, Katrina, thank you for coming on. Thank you for your research in this space. Like I said at the start, really important space. It certainly taught me a lot, particularly this notion of clusters and how the impacts and potential consequences can be really significant and adverse when these risky behaviours do cluster together. So I think there'll be a lot of value as well for listeners. So really appreciate you sharing your wisdom on the podcast.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Mental Wellbeing College. If you've made it this far, it means you've gleaned a ton of value from today's episode, or you've fallen asleep. I sincerely hope that it's the former, and if it is, I would be so grateful if you were to hit subscribe, follow, or to share this podcast with someone you care about. Our mission here at the Mental Wellbeing College is to provide a free and accessible resource for people to take action and implement to improve their own mental well-being. And you subscribing, following, and or sharing helps us to achieve that mission and to impact people in need. Thanks so much for tuning in. It means a lot. We'll see you next week on the Mental Wellbeing College.